Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
How's everybody doing today?
Feeling fine.
Have you ever realized that you might not ever say your names if I didn't cue you to say your names on the show?
Probably not.
You might be prompt dependent.
Oh, okay.
What? Oh my goodness, that's going to be our topic for today. But first, before we do that, I got a couple other things. You probably want to know what you're listening to, and that is a podcast in which we discuss behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. Every week we have a new topic, which hint, is prompt dependence this week. And sometimes we get very lucky and we have someone who has studied and researched that topic joining us. And that's the case today. Wouldn't it be great if I just said, and sometimes we get that, but not today, it's just us. No, we have a special guest. Special guest, please introduce yourselves to everybody.
Hi, everyone. I am Catia Cividini-Motta, if you want to know my entire name. There will be a test in the end where you have to spell it. Just kidding. I work at the University of South Florida in Tampa, Florida. I teach there. I supervise a practicum for our students, and I do fun research. What else do you want to know? I'm from Brazil, right? So that's pretty much it. And prior to USF, I worked with Jackie and Diana at the New England Center for Children.
Yes, we go way back with Catia.
And we're very lucky to have you on today to talk about prompt dependence. And Catia, I must say, you are not prompt dependent in being able to talk about your background, because I didn't cue you and say, tell us about your background. You just did it right away. You got it. You picked up on the social cues. And you just went for it. Good job.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the differential reinforcement of, my not prompt dependent behavior.
That's my problem. I probably need to change my differential reinforcement schedule for Jackie and Diana. It's too vague, maybe. I don't know. We'll get into all that. So,
okay.
Like I said at the top, this week we're talking about prompt dependence, and we'll be discussing 3 articles. And why don't I say what those articles are, shall I? The first one, I'm just going to give them in historical, chronological order here. So the first one we'll be discussing is the effects of differential reinforcement of unprompted responding on the skill acquisition of children with autism by Karsten and Carr from Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, 2009. Then we'll be talking about another article from JABA, effects of 2 variations of differential reinforcement on prompt dependency by Dr. Cividini-Motta and Dr. Ahearn, who we've also had on the show. So this is a special article. We've had all the authors on the show, and that was from 2013. And then finally, we'll be rounding it out with an article which is near and dear to my heart, the Battle Royale of Treatment Options article, Gorgon and Kodak's Comparison of Interventions to Treat Prompt Dependence for Children with Developmental Disabilities, also from JABA from 2019. Those are my favorites. I love it when someone says, here are some treatments. Let's see which one's the best. Even though you would think over time I would have learned the answer, none of them are the best, or they're all kind of good in some ways, maybe. No definitive answers sometimes. All right. So first off, why don't we start by talking about the challenge of prompt dependence? We can define prompt dependence, talk about how it's affected, our own practice with a variety of clients. And Catia, as our guest, would you mind starting that conversation off?
Sure. So in general, prompt dependency refers to our inability to fade prompts, right? Because really it's our failure, not the client's failure, to fade the prompts such that responding only occurs when prompts are provided. In other words, we're not transferring control to the natural stimulus that should be occasioning those responses. And that can hinder acquisition, but it can also impact the individual's abilities to function independently. And that can be a big issue, especially as our clients get older and are transitioning to adult services or even placements that have less staffing available, right? So if the individual can't do anything on his or her own, those individuals are less likely to succeed in those settings. And that is basically why I got interested in this topic. I had a client in NEC many years ago. My dear client, his responding was always dependent on a prompt. And that led me to look into the research. There wasn't any at that time. And it led to this paper that we'll be discussing today.
Yeah, I worked with a similar client who was physically prompt dependent. So if you ask the client to choose out of an array, the client would just hold their hand up over the array, waiting for someone to grab their hand and point them to the next spot. And it even got to the point where even if you touched the elbow, they would make a response, but that you had to touch some part of their body, even if it wasn't their hand, in order for them to respond.
And I love that example, Jackie, because I think something that we forget to consider when we're looking at prompt-dependent behavior is the reinforcers for that behavior, right? And in some cases, it may be the prompt itself. The physical prompt, the verbal prompt might be reinforcing for that behavior for certain individuals. And that might be why the treatments evaluated on that paper we're discussing today, the efficacy differed, right? Potentially because the functional reinforcers for the prompt-dependent behavior were different for each of the participants.
Mm.
That makes a lot of sense. I like, too, the way that you said it's not the fault of the individual, right? It's our fault if we are encountering the situation because we haven't properly discovered the reinforcers that are in play or how we can best teach it. And I think prompt dependence is like an interesting term, right? Because I'm almost kind of surprised that we call it this in our field because I feel like it indicates that it's some sort of internal state about the person, right? Like, oh, they are dependent, right?
That's how I hear it discussed a lot in working in a variety of settings is, oh, that student, they're prompt dependent. Like, oh, did you check, it's somewhere in their genes is the prompt dependent gene got turned. Yeah. It's this internal state of being prompt dependent. Like that's just who that person is. They're always going to need prompts. And, speaking to the point of the research, Catia, you're right. Looking into like, well, why would that be? There's sort of, a lot of hypotheses and we've put out a few here, but that sense of what other, research is out there because we know it's not just, it's them. Oh, well, what are you going to do?
Yeah. And I think that we as a field, we need to change that terminology, right? And there was a talk at ABAI a few years ago by Paolo Ghigliardi. So he's from Beacon. And he actually proposed a change in terminology.
Oh.
We should be referring to the behavior is prompt dependent, not the child is prompt dependent. So focus on the response.
Yes.
We do that with every single other behavior, right?
Right.
Self-injurious behavior is maintained by attention. So why are we not doing that with this behavior? Because it is a behavior.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I love that he brought that up. I guess he and I are on the same page. I don't think I saw his talk. But thinking about the history in which the behavior has been developed is really important when we're examining prompt dependency. I don't know if that phrase is actually better or worse, right?
I think what we need to think about is we need to look at a teaching session, a teaching program, instructional program, whatever we want to call it, almost like a concurrent operant arrangement. There are multiple response options and multiple potential consequences. So the child can respond independently and get something. The child can wait for a prompt and get something. The child can make an error, and then there's a different consequence. And those program consequences are the ones that are going to shape that prompt dependency.
Absolutely. And I think it probably varies, and I know we'll get into this, but varies place to place as far as what the sort of default reinforcement situation is, right, with regard to either prompted or unprompted responding. And it may be something that, if you work a certain place, then this is just kind of quote unquote the way it's done. And it may be that you're not providing differential reinforcement for prompted or unprompted responses. And if that's the case, then honestly, it's not something I had thought about too much until I read all these articles. And I said, oh, wow, there's so many options as far as how to address this. And some of it may start really in the formulation of how you're going to teach the skill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, too, that, we want to be careful of when we're designing these types of initial training situations is thinking about what the reinforcers are that are inherent to the situation and how we can continue to promote and reinforce independent responding and not punish that, such that we end up in a situation where the individual's compliance with our prompts is what's reinforced more than their learning.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when we talk about acquisition, and where prompt dependence, could develop, and is it the same for every student? We've talked about the idea of, well, there's going to be some amount of reinforcement. There's going to be some differential reinforcement. Usually it's pretty clear right versus, accurate versus inaccurate response is going to be, differentiated, but also what other pieces might be differentially reinforced. Now we often think about, well, what prompts are being used, or what's the schedule of fading those prompts? How are we responding to the prompted versus unprompted? So a myriad of places where the prompt dependence of the response could possibly develop. And then, Catia, your research looked specifically at the differential reinforcement schedules. And that was an extension of the 2009 Karsten and Carr study, correct?
Correct, yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, was that something that you just wanted to explore that avenue, or in looking at the research, you said, well, this is the most definitive article I've seen so far, so let's keep going in this line of research? Or kind of what was the genesis of your research article?
Yeah, so the Karsten and Carr was the only paper I could find at that time that had explored differential reinforcement where they were manipulating quality of reinforcers, right? Because the previous studies had looked at reinforcer schedules. Mm-hmm. So FR6 versus FR10, so on and so forth. So that that format of differential reinforcement was intriguing, but it also was by looking at the clients I was working with. For most of those clients, they were receiving the same reinforcer for prompted correct and prompt independent responses. So that led to the hypothesis that their prompt dependency was likely related to the lack of differential consequences for those two classes of responses. Mm-hmm. And by manipulating quality of reinforcement, that seems to be a much easier type of reinforcement to implement than to keep track of, how many prompted responses were reinforced versus, are we at FR6, are we at FR10, so on and so forth. Mm. And that's what led to that research.
I guess before we get into your article, we probably should go at least a quick summary.
Dip our toes in.
Yeah, we'll dip our toes in, because then again, I always love a good extension article, because it's like, I feel like I read the original as well. So I'm going to get two for one in there. Jackie, do you want to just do a quick summary of the Karsten and Carr?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and Catia, if you want to add anything in, please do, because you know this research way better than I do. But in this current study, they looked at how they could look at the delivery of high-quality reinforcers exclusively only following unprompted reinforcement, and then looking at high quality of reinforcers following both prompted and unprompted responses. So they called this non-differential reinforcement. They called the first condition that I spoke about differential reinforcement, and they looked at scale acquisitions for 2 children with autism. They were fairly young children. One of them was 5, and the other one was 3. So that's fairly young. And so what they did was they first conducted a preference assessment, and the preference assessments were different across the 2 participants. One of them received a brief multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment to rank their highest food items. And, both of them did. JK, the reinforcer evaluation was different. So both of them used the multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment. They had 3 highest foods, and they used those throughout the reinforcer assessment as well as the treatment comparison. And so the reinforcer evaluation was different for the 2 participants. When they used the reinforcer evaluation, they used a reversal design for Eric to look at praise and praise plus food and look at where a break point was. So when responding was going to, stop altogether. And one thing I love about reinforcer assessments and evaluations is the arbitrary response that authors choose. So here they chose disc pressing. I always imagine that's like the "that was easy" staple button.
Oh, I thought it would be like those toys where you push the button and it like shoots out a disc at someone. But
maybe.
I imagine that would be so much fun. The kids would just be doing it for, I don't need M&Ms or anything for this. I'll just do it all day.
Yeah, that's too fun.
Like the Ninja Turtle van. That's what I'm thinking of. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for
pizza.
Yeah, I think it's probably the "that was easy" button, but it probably didn't say "that was easy." Because that may
a Big Mac button.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then for the second participant, his was less fun, placing foam tiles in a bin.
Yeah, that sounds extremely boring.
Yeah.
It does. It sounds horrible, right?
Well, not always.
But I imagine that they tried the disc pressing first, and maybe that response persisted under extinction.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had to switch to something else.
Right. That is probably what happened, right?
Because you shot the discs out. It's so much fun. You can't stop, right?
Do you think those are called a Big Mac button because they look like a Big Mac from the side?
Yeah. I love that you're just thinking about this right now.
It just occurred to me, and I want to make sure everyone knew that that's what I was thinking.
Well, now I'm just hungry, and I want to go eat something. So thanks, Dan. And I'm going to be hungry the rest of this episode.
That's awesome. So for that one participant with the reinforcer evaluation, again, they had the reinforcement condition, and then they had a no consequence condition for the disc pressing. And then for the second participant, they did a progressive ratio 2 reinforcer evaluation. Here they looked at break points to see when responding would stop. So that's kind of fun. And no surprise for both participants, praise and food produced higher quality and more responding than praise alone.
Mm-hmm.
Are you guys surprised?
I'm not surprised.
No. Mm-mm.
Okay, well, there you go.
Yeah. I like food,
I love food.
so I'm not surprised at all.
Yeah. And then they used an alternating treatment design to look at the effects of the differential reinforcement of unprompting responding for both participants on acquisition. So they were using various tacks or picture sequences as the training stimuli. And then depending on the condition, either they received praise and food alone or just praise, right? No, praise and food alone or just praise.
Yeah, so they either received praise and food for independent correct responses, and then just praise for correct prompted responses. So that was the differential reinforcement condition. In the other condition, it was praise and food for both response classes. So correct independent and correct prompted.
Yeah. And one thing I found that was fascinating is they did 2 kind of conditions. For Eric, specifically, they found for him that praise and food demonstrated an increase in acquisition. But then at the end, both conditions demonstrated an increase in acquisition. So that's fascinating, right? But if you look at his entire data set, it appears that differential reinforcement was more effective. So that I just found that was fascinating, right? So what happened to that praise? Did it gain more reinforcing properties, right? Like, who knows? Was there a pairing going on? The authors kind of talk about that in the discussion. And then for the second participant, we didn't see any responding, right? So both conditions were effective for Steve in the beginning. So what they did is they teased apart the differential reinforcement condition and the non-differential reinforcement condition to see if maybe there was a multi-treatment effect. And in fact, there was. So what they found was that when separated out, differential reinforcement was the only effective condition to increase responding in these conditions.
I was just going to comment, give praise to the authors for doing that additional evaluation in the end, because it would have been easier for them to just conclude they're both effective, the end. But they they went a step further and they tried to assess whether there was something else leading to that similar result initially. And that's something important for all of us to do, right? And so kudos to them for doing that, because in the end, their results clearly indicated that the differential reinforcement was more effective overall for their participants.
So let's jump ahead into the future and talk about your extension, Catia.
It's now the past.
It was now the past. Then it was the future. Now it is the past.
Yeah, so my study, and that was the study, it was my thesis. Can you believe I did my thesis in 2012 or, I don't know, 2011? Crazy. How old am I? But so in our study, what we did is we had 2 types of differential reinforcement conditions, right? So Karsten and Carr, they looked at a high quality reinforcer following independent correct responses, and then a low quality for prompted correct responses, and no reinforcement for errors. So we had that same condition, but in addition to that, we had another differential reinforcement condition where prompted correct responses also resulted in nothing. So we put prompted correct responses on extinction because our goal was really to see how much of a differential consequence do we need to have for independent correct responses versus prompted correct responses to see a shift in allocation, right?
Clever.
It was just a lucky guess.
Also heartening to hear, though, right? It's also heartening to hear that you're like, oh, maybe. And then you're like, oh.
Yeah. But that's the nice thing about doing research, right? You start asking questions and then you go and you do your research and then your results surprise you. And sometimes they support the hypothesis you had initially and sometimes it does not.
And sometimes it's just a hot mess.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So we had 4 participants in our study. So the first thing one of the things that is different about our study and Karsten's study is we only recruited individuals whose responding was dependent on prompts. So we began by doing a prompt dependency assessment.
Do you make that up?
Yes, I made that up.
How long does that take?
To make it up or to actually do the assessment?
Both, I think.
Oh, right? The assessment was very quick. We observed a couple DTT sessions, and we instructed the teachers to just delay the prompt to 10 seconds. And we took data on whether the participant responded before, after the prompt. And our criteria was if they wait for prompting on at least 80% of the trials, that would be our criteria to have them participate. Developing that assessment, coming to that assessment took a lot of discussions with Bill Ahearn.
Usually those don't come easy. It's not like something you are driving home and you're like, oh, I just developed this prompt dependency assessment.
Yeah. No, it took a lot of time looking at the literature, right? Because previous research references prompt dependency over and over and over. And, so looking through all of those studies to see if anyone had actually developed a way to assess. And no one had, unfortunately.
Catia, did you have anyone that you attempted to recruit for the study that then when you provided the 10-second wait period actually started to respond?
No.
Oh, okay. Because that would have been kind of cool, right? Not to preview what Rob's going to talk about, but sometimes that length of wait time could be enough to catalyze the action.
Yes, yeah. That was not the case for my participants. I also knew them all, one way or another. I had observed them already, spoken to their clinical team. They had a long history of waiting for prompts for a long time.
Yeah.
The individual that I worked with directly, he would wait for a minute. Literally just put his hand in front of the comparison stimuli during the DTT session and just wait.
Yeah.
For over a minute.
Yeah. And then, not to get into it too much, but then that becomes a situation that's also aversive for the teacher, right? So then you're like, I've heard time and again teachers say I know that they quote unquote know this. I know that they can do this, right? But they won't. They just keep waiting. And everyone just wants to get it over with and done with so we can move on, right? So those are situations that end up being really challenging for the staff too, to try to wait out a response when everyone just wants to prompt it
move on,
right? That would be reinforcing for both parties. It can be really, really challenging, and it's not necessarily a reflection always of not having acquired the skill, right? But there's some other reinforcement situation happening in there, right? Like you were saying before, there's some other thing that's more reinforcing than independently responding, and that could be due to a complex history. Yeah,
for sure. One plausible explanation is just the probability of reinforcement is higher if you wait for a prompt, because corrected prompt responses are usually always reinforced.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And, doing my kids' homework with them, I see that too, right? They want to ask us what the answers are. I'm like, well, you can try it out, figure it out, right? And I want them to trial and error through the problem. They're like, I just want to be right.
Yeah.
I just want to be done and right. And have a better chance of being done and right if I ask you what the answer is versus trying to figure it out on my own. It's like the same parallels here.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. And for us as parents, right, we know that we should wait for our children to do it by themselves. But sometimes we're running late to the next meeting. So it's easier for us to just go in there and do it.
Absolutely.
I often feel that way in the mornings when I'm trying to get two kids out the door. Like, just put on your shoe, put on your shoe, put on your shoe.
Right.
It's the most prompting, put on your shoe. Come on, put on your shoe.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And they're like, fine, I'll just do it.
Yeah.
Do they stick their foot out and like hover it over the shoe? And they're like, I know, moms, I know this is gonna do it. She's gonna put it on.
Yeah, they can do it. They know they can do it, but they know that I'm going to do it eventually if they don't do it, right?
Right. Yeah. Huh. And for some individuals who might have real anxiety about being wrong or not receiving the reinforcer or being presented with the error correction procedure, right? Like that would all be reasons toward allocation and responding to waiting.
Right? Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned the error correction procedure because that can be a punisher, right? So, so negative reinforcement could be why prompt dependency persists.
Yes.
The individual is avoiding that negative consequence of the error correction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So in our study, we had 4 participants, just like Karsten and all. We began with some preference assessments, reinforcer assessments. We wanted to just really make sure that there was a difference in quality between edibles and praise versus just praise alone for one of the participants. And for the other ones, it was tokens plus praise versus praise alone. The background behind that is all 3 younger participants had a token system in place. Frank was older in the adult program, and they did not use tokens there. So that's why we used edibles.
One thing I love about how you chose your participants too is that they are older, right? Mm-hmm. So you would imagine if I'm thinking about like a reinforcement history of prompt dependence, it's probably going to be easy to change that history or those contingencies with younger students, the 2 and 3-year-olds, right? Because they've had less time to develop a prompt dependence, but you have a 38-year-old man, right?
Yeah.
So that has a lot of history associated with prompt dependency potentially. And so when I saw that, I was like, yes, right? Because if this works for him, it's likely to work for others because he has a significant history, that's backing that. So that's something that I found fascinating. And even if you didn't mean to do it, a nice extension.
Yeah. And did you see which differential reinforcement condition worked for him?
Don't spoil it.
Oh, ta-da. All right.
A little teaser.
Yeah. Likely due to the longer history, but we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
So,
you want to touch, Catia, on the target touching?
During
the reinforcer assessment? Yeah.
So, like Jackie was mentioning before, sometimes we have to be creative with our free operant responses during reinforcer assessments. So in our study, we did target touching where we had 2 cut out circles in front of the participants. And a response entailed touching both circles in an alternating manner. So if you touch the left and then the right, that's a response. If you keep touching the one on the left over and over and over and over and over again, that is not a response. I would love to take credit for that, but I did not come up with that target touching definition on my own.
Right. Yeah, I don't know the original study, but I mean, being in Bill's lab, I also used the target.
Yeah, it's it's maybe at all. It's maybe
used little poker chips.
Oh
yeah. So it was a separate line of research. I think it may have been from Shriver's line of research.
You're correct. It was Eileen Roscoe's lab.
Oh, okay.
I believe where I got this idea from.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eileen.
Thanks, Eileen. But yeah, I remember as, a grad student, I was like, why are we touching 2 pieces of paper as our targets? Like, what are we doing right now, right? Yeah. But then later I was like, well, it's because if you just had to be touching one, the response likely would persist.
The response effort is so small.
A little bit more complex response where you had to move between the 2 targets in order for it to count as one response. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure you would agree with me that then trying to tabulate that afterwards,
it gets tricky.
Is really hard. Yeah, because they have to alternate, and that it's really confusing.
Yeah, the tip I will give your audience is separate the targets really far. So it's longer, right, to emit the response. So it's easier for you to count them.
Smart, yes.
Slightly higher response effort too, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to be really deliberate in your motion. Yeah. So it's just like when you read it, you're like, what are they talking about? That's a funky thing. But so that's what it was.
Yeah. I always have to demonstrate that to my students. You know, I tell them what it looks like and they're like, what? Because I always tell them to use this response in their reinforcer assessments for their research. But I have to pull out the cards and like, this is what I meant. Then they're like, oh, yeah, got it.
Cool.
All right. So we taught the participants to match printed words to pictures, and the printed words were Portuguese words.
Oh, what do you know?
Speak Portuguese, surprise, not Spanish like everyone else in South America, right? And the reason we selected those similarly was to eliminate any history. You know, if you pick Portuguese, English words, some kids may have been taught those words previously. And then even though they may perform poorly in baseline, just a couple trials of retraining might lead to the response increasing to 100% again. So we wanted to eliminate any history. And it's easier to control for difficulty because then, the Portuguese words tend to consist of syllables, 2 letters each, right? So bolo, bola, 4 letters, 2 syllables each. So
what do those mean?
Made my research easier. Bolo is cake. Bola is a ball.
Oh, what's bonnet?
Bonnet, baseball cap.
Cool.
Huh.
Okay.
All right.
Not only do you learn about literature, you learn about words.
And your audience is getting a Portuguese lesson today.
Right.
Bonus.
Well, now I just want some cake, though, Catia. So, I mean, we got a Big Mac, we got a cake.
Yeah.
It's lunchtime, obviously.
Apparently, Rob didn't have lunch. I think
did not
might
have
be
lunch.
what's going on.
All right. So we use an alternating treatments design. We control for difficulty of the stimuli. We randomly assign them to one of the teaching procedures. And then we taught the participants the various targets. And we looked at in which condition they would learn the skills faster. And what we learned was that for Eddie, one of the younger participants, he learned the skills faster in the differential reinforcement condition where the high quality consequence was provided for correct independent responses. And for him, it was tokens and praise. And just praise was provided for prompt correct responses. He did not learn at all when we had the other differential reinforcement condition in place. So if your audience has the article I'm talking about, the second panel of the figure, where there were no consequences for correct prompted responses, then we switch the contingencies and magic, he learns. Yeah. He also did not learn at all in the no differential reinforcement condition where high quality consequences were provided for prompted correct and independent correct responses.
Catia, do you remember what was happening in his current teaching sessions at his school?
There was no differential reinforcement in place for correct and independent responses.
They must have been frustrated, right?
Yes.
Thank goodness you came along.
Yeah.
We were pleased with the results. And the clinical team then changed his program to include differential reinforcement for DTT, task analysis, all of his programming across the day. It's nice. It's really nice when results of a research are incorporated into a clinical program, so you have, for me, my reinforcer was, hey, I got to graduate and look at those neat findings. But at the same time, it was, hey, my research had a positive impact on this kid and hopefully his future placement in, everything. So.
Absolutely. And I love that we get that story now, right? Because often like this type of research, people say, oh, it's translational research, right? Like they're learning some arbitrary stimulus. No offense on the Portuguese words, but for them it was arbitrary, you know, and like, how's that going to help them? But it really did help them, or has the potential to help them like long term. So I think that that's really exciting. You get to see like the whole research to practice arc here with your study.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Thank you. Results for Bill were very similar. He also learned the skills in fewer trials, on fewer sessions in the differential reinforcement condition, where tokens and praise were provided for correct independent responses. The same was the case for Lucas. He also, that differential reinforcement condition was most efficient for him. But then results differed for Frank.
Not surprising.
Mm-hmm.
No, right?
Yeah.
Older history of reinforcement for waiting, for a prompt.
Yeah.
So for him, the condition that was effective was the one where prompted correct responses were placed on extinction. So you get nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can speak to whether you saw any, collateral emotional responding when those, prompts were not provided, or, with reinforcement. You might not remember because it's like 2011, right? But I can imagine if I was receiving some sort of consequence on a response for my entire life, and then all of a sudden one day Catia walks in and she's like, no thanks. You are no longer going to be, getting this consequence. I can imagine I would be probably frustrated a little bit.
Mm-hmm. If I recall correctly, and I do recall this young man fairly well, there were no emotional responding. However, there were multiple attempts to get that prompt, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, he's hovering over the comparison stimuli, and when the prompt is not delivered and his hand is moving closer to me and closer to me, I think at one point he even grabbed my hand. It was like, come on, lady, just take my hand.
Help me out here.
But that actually gives me hope, right? Because I think one thing that when I was reading these articles that I was thinking about is that if you have these consequences in place for a long time, we might expect emotional responding to occur if extinction is in place. But in this instance, he had a really long history and he didn't see that. So maybe that's, hopeful for clinicians that want to give this a shot.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And for everyone else, you saw learning occur with the high, moderate, differential reinforcement.
Yeah. And that is what I would recommend, right?
Mm-hmm.
Begin with that format of differential reinforcement first. If that's not effective, then consider this other alternative where prompted correct responses are on extinction.
I always knew that you could use differential reinforcement for prompt dependence, but I always thought of it as this all or nothing thing, right? I only thought of it as the DR versus extinction type of situation. And I don't know why. I'm like kind of embarrassed that, with my own, students, I always said, well, we don't want to use that because it'll just be too hard on them, quote unquote, right? Like I don't want to risk extinguishing all responding, particularly if they're young learners and we really want to continue to have them learn new skills and grow. Like I don't want to risk it. I don't know why it didn't occur to me to think about this quality of reinforcement comparison because you got such great results. And then Rob, you're going to talk some more.
Were you prompt dependent on? Was your behavior, I should say, prompt dependent somehow?
What, that I wanted to be spoon-fed the research? Maybe. I don't know.
You were like, I have the article. I'm not going to turn the page.
No, I don't know. But I'm so glad that I have this whole, I've done, now I've read all these articles and I have a better understanding of this topic because I will be able to share that with my students more so that you could just make the comparison, the differential and the reinforcer different, and that can produce good results, at least for you, in 75% of the time.
Yeah. And, we manipulated quality, but other parameters of reinforcement could be manipulated, right? Such as immediacy. So how about there's an immediate token delivered for corrected independent responses, and maybe tokens are delayed or praise is delayed for correct prompted responses. There's some research, some more recent research looking at differential reinforcement as a treatment for problem behavior, where they are looking at parameters of reinforcement and evaluating sensitivity, right? Some individuals are more sensitive to quality versus immediacy versus the magnitude of reinforcers. My doc student who just graduated did some of that study, Dr. Hannah McNall, and really showing that, even small differences, as sometimes it might be something as, 5 seconds versus 10 seconds is sufficient for the individual to allocate responding to, the more immediate but lower magnitude reinforcer. Yeah, I think future research in this area could evaluate other parameters of reinforcement.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's super cool.
Yeah. Well, like you said, Catia, we've not covered all of the aspects of differential reinforcement that could be at play with prompt dependence, but I think we've certainly covered a number of them.
A lot, yeah.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break. And then when we come back, could there be other factors that we want to take into account? Oh, we'll find out then. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking with Dr. Catia Cividini-Motta about prompt dependence. And before we continue on with our discussion, I wanted to make sure that I remind all you listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. Learning credit? They keep changing these names and I can't keep track. Learning something. And it's 1. You will need to listen to the whole episode, of course, which I hope you would do anyway. And then after that, go to the website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUS, get CEUs, and you'll need 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first of those code words right now, and this is a special one from our guest. The first one is immediacy, IMMEDIACY. Happening right away, happening immediately, be a reference to the immediacy of some environmental event. All right, I think we need to talk about more articles with some immediacy. So let's do that, shall we? You like that?
That's good. It was really good.
That's what they pay me the big bucks for. It's my code word knowledge and segue ability. All right, so Catia, you spoke at great length about the research you did, some of the previous research, some ongoing or recently published research looking at differential reinforcement and its potential as a means of kind of mitigating prompt dependency, possibly playing into prompt dependency if you're not taking it into account. But in the other article that you wanted to review, the Gorgon and Kodak article, there are some other areas in sort of what we think of as kind of our standard, discrete trial TA programming that might also lend themselves to either developing prompt dependence or resulting in less chance of prompt dependence occurring for, a given response. Some of those would be things like prompt fading. Is prompt fading being used? Is it being used effectively for the learner that you are, implementing prompt fading for, or the program you're implementing it for? And again, for prompt fading, I think everyone's pretty familiar with it, but just the idea that you're gradually removing some controlling prompt so that the individual is, the response control is transferring from the prompt to whatever the naturally occurring SD is. And again, there are a lot of different ways to do this. I know I've had plenty of folks say like, what's the best prompt fading procedure? It's like, well, I don't know. There's like a million of them. Just which one seems to be working? That's the best one. You got it. So that can play into it. And then the other piece, and this was one that the extended response interval or the unlimited delay to prompt, I don't think I'd ever thought of this one because it seems a little mean. The idea of, I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to wait, buddy. I'm going to wait here and you'll eventually respond or not. And certainly there'd been some research that Gorgon and Kodak discussed where it had been used in TAs, that it was pretty fast way. So if you did use it, it actually did lead to some fast increases in learning the new response or in acquisition. But there were a lot of errors that also occurred during the procedure. So that's going to be its own set of problems.
Yeah.
But had never actually been reviewed in terms of could it have an impact on the development or the kind of remediation of a prompt-dependent response. So again, as I put in my notes, the purpose of this article is Battle Royale. Again, my favorite type of article where we look at, well, what could be causing prompt dependence to develop? Or how could we treat students who have responses that are prompt dependent? And certainly the idea is we could look at the idea of differential reinforcement like you did in your published research because, hey, we know that has had an effect. We could look at different styles of prompt fading because, again, we've seen that be effective with a lot of students. So why couldn't that be used more effectively in cases where prompt dependence has developed? And then let's also throw in the new contender, kind of the rookie prompt hierarchy or prompt procedure of the unlimited delay to prompt, which just sounds so mean. Like, I will sit here forever. We're never going to the swings. It's just going to be staring you down. Who's going to respond to this response?
They should call that the awkward silence procedure.
Better for practitioners than for parents.
It works for college professors.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
We use it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The awkward
Just
silence.
stare at your students. And
Yep.
it's so aversive, right?
I love it when people, meaning me, say, I can wait.
See, that only works for me if my professor says, if you answer your questions, we get out of class early. Because otherwise, it's like, if I know there's a definitive, if you answer my questions, you will get out of here a little bit earlier because we don't have to do the awkward pause, then I will fill awkward pauses a lot faster. When I don't know, it's like, I don't like this awkward pause, but I kind of know this is what's happening, so I'm going to try to write it out, and we'll see. I think I can outlast somebody in this class and not look like a fool when I say something.
Well, often there's like 2 or 3 people that jump in, so you just wait for them to jump in.
You learn
who
you're counting on in your class. Like, if I just wait long enough, I know Billy's going to talk.
Rob's going to.
I know Rob's going to say something. It might not have anything to do with the topic, but he'll talk.
But he'll say something. Yeah.
I just also want to note if people are interested in thinking about variations in response prompts, then you should check out Seaver and Beret 2014.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very good paper.
Yeah. And they mentioned that a bunch in the Gorgon and Kodak. They said over and over and over. So in terms of kind of like this article, Katia, is this something that when you saw it, you were like excited, like, oh, good, I can't wait to see the final results? Or you sort of were aware enough of the research that it wasn't, surprising that this was kind of going to be a next step in the literature?
There's so little published on the topic, right? So I frequently just do a search to see, is there something new on prompt dependency? Mm-hmm. And when you all mention the possibility of me being on your show, I did exactly that. I was like, what is new? What is new? And I came across this paper. And what was most interesting to me was the fact that they were looking at something else other than differential reinforcement. Not as surprised about the findings, right? So in the majority of the cases, when we're comparing different teaching procedures across different behaviors for different clients, participants, the results are different.
Yes.
Human organisms, what's wrong with us? Can't we just pick one treatment and that's the best one for everybody? I mean, come on. What are we doing here?
Yeah, I know, right? So, that was the main reason I thought it was important for us to discuss this paper, to see that if differential reinforcement is not effective for your client, here are some other interventions that you could try. And perhaps you do something similar to what they did. You do a quick evaluation initially. Take a couple, simple behaviors and try to teach those using one of those interventions and see which one is more effective for your client. And then you have some data to guide your decision in selecting a treatment for your client. because that's the reality, right? We should be using data to guide our decisions, and we should individualize our treatments to meet our clients' needs. I keep thinking about, we look at a variety of topographies of problem behavior, aggression, self-injurious behavior, whatever it is, and we talk about function, right? So it's the same thing with prompt dependency. What is the function of that behavior? And then we pick an intervention that addresses that function. And I really hope that that's where the field is moving to next. And I think that this is the first step in that direction.
Were you so jazzed when they replicated and extended your results?
I was so jazzed when they cited my prompt dependency assessment. I was like, that is my assessment.
Yeah. I mean, that took you a long time to make. That is the one thing when I was reading, I was like, I bet that feels good. Right? Someone wasn't like, this is the worst thing I've ever written. Thank you. Like, Catia.
Yeah.
Like, it was so good, we did it again.
Well, I always feel bad when, especially, when we're prepping for episodes, because we're reading a couple articles that are all around the same topic. And I always feel bad when there's one I read, I'm like, that was a great article. And then I go to the next one that was written like 5 years later, and they don't bother to mention the article I just, I'm like, ooh, this, like, what's going on there? Did they not know this existed?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
When the Karsten and Carr article doesn't, prompt dependence is not a keyword in the text.
No, it's not.
So,
I believe I came across simply by looking at differential reinforcement. I was searching for differential reinforcement literature related to skill acquisition. And that's how I came across that paper.
Yeah. But that can be challenging for someone to know how to find that. They don't know exactly the right words to search for.
We've all kind of hinted a bit at the results. Why don't I go through the steps of what the authors here did? So we had 3 participants in this study. We had 2 adolescents and 1 young child. They all either had ASD or some developmental disability. And similar to your study, Catia, they all had been noted as, man, there seems to be a lot of prompt dependency in their responding. So we had Ralph, who would often ask kind of like questions or ask for more information during these behavior chains, which I think they kind of described as sort of like, now what? What should I do next? So him advocating for himself, but in a way is like, I think you know how to do this. I don't know why you're asking me. We had Kenny, who just received lots of these non-specific prompts. And this is actually different from in your study, Catia, where you were looking at specific programs, and sort of these participants really seem to just need prompts, like just something.
All day long.
What's going on? Hey, did you remember? Hey, remember that? Like it didn't have to do with the response you were asking. As long as you were saying things, they seemed to keep responding. And if you stopped, they wouldn't engage in these different behaviors. And then the youngest was Mario. And again, could do a lot of skills. They know he's very independent, but still needed lots of prompts just to engage in a variety of skills. The study all happened at participants' homes and the locations relevant to whatever the tasks were for the individuals. And again, they're very different tasks. I think we had, home kind of chore type tasks. There was a tactive action task. So looking at a lot of different types of responses here. And again, just like in the previous studies, what do we want to know with research related to prompt dependence is, well, what's the independent correct percentage? What's the correct prompted percentage? And then they also looked at latency to response as well. How long does it take for these responses to occur in the regular occurring kind of chains that were developed or that were being taught? We had an adapted alternating treatments design, which is always fun to do when you've got to kind of have these little treatment battle royales, as you want to be able to switch between the different activities. They did, like you said, Catia, they used your prompt dependence assessment, which I just wrote in my notes as like, see Catia study, because I knew you'd have already talked about it by this point in the show. So don't need to talk about it anymore. All right. It's all the work's done.
However, I should note there was a minor difference, right, in the way they did their assessment. So they only waited for 5 seconds before prompting versus in our study, we waited 10 seconds. And I think that that's important to note because in one of their interventions, the extended response interval, they waited 10 seconds before prompting. Right. And we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I think we should pay attention to that 5 second, 10 second delay to prompting.
Okay.
Yeah,
that is a good point. Good point. In looking at the tasks, similar to your study, you have to they tried to balance the types of tasks that were being used based on either steps in the chain or, the colors of the stimuli being used, all the things that you would hope to see in research if you're going to try to control for the difference in task, either difficulty or cues around. And so, throughout we have, our baseline condition where we have our task that the individual is going to engage in, and there's no feedback for errors, or for Ralph was doing a kind of a behavior chain. So they'd wait 5 seconds. And if he didn't do the next step, they'd kind of prompt so he could continue on with the chain. So it wasn't just a one and done if he didn't engage in the response. The differential reinforcement was, one of the conditions. We had looking at the praise and edible for Ralph, a praise and token for Kenny, and praise and a break with a tangible for Mario, the youngest participant. If there was no independent correct response, they provided a controlling prompt and they waited 5 seconds. The controlling prompt was just whatever prompt seemed to work for the actual correct response to occur. Now, I don't think there was anything much fancier than that they discussed in the study. It just, this worked. So it's now called the controlling prompt. Mm-hmm. We're looking to see if that differential reinforcement contingency affected the independent responding of the participants. They had their prompt fading condition where you had praise and either a tangible or edible or token depending on the participant. And that was delivered for independent correct responses. If they didn't engage in the response within the appropriate amount of time, they'd provide either a full vocal prompt or a model prompt. And then after some criteria, 80% correct responses with whatever the prompt was, they'd sort of move to the partial prompt, then they'd move to a lesser partial prompt. And again, here they're just looking at, can we see a transfer of stimulus control if we're just very clear about how we're fading out our prompts and setting a set criteria for when we're going to change the prompt for each participant. And then the extended response interval, where you kind of just wait for 10 seconds to see if the independent correct response occurs. If not, it sort of just continued on as in the prompt fading condition where you just sort of kept going with the prompt, or they ended the trial if the student made no response.
Yeah. So it didn't make them wait ad infinitum.
Or ad nauseum.
Just for clarification, I know you said earlier you were worried about that, but that did not happen.
I said that in jest, though. I don't think what IRB is going to be like. You're just going to make them wait for days and days. Sounds great to me.
10 seconds is a long time, though. It doesn't seem like a long time. You write it out. It's like 10 seconds, but then when you're like there, you're like
1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi.
Deep breathing. You can do it.
I'm just going to prompt you. A little bit. It's fine.
I just want to.
Yeah, and then again, one participant, and we could talk about it in the results, but they added an error correction procedure after the fact because of his pattern of responding. As we've kind of said, as fun as it would be, the results are, and this one's the best, use it all the time, put it in your manuals. The results are kind of idiosyncratic in which you had some of the kind of options and the modifications worked to some extent for some participants, but not for others. It was nice that they were trying to look at both what was effective and then what was efficient. So they did have the latency measure in there. So you could sort of, you could choose like a best of technique for each individual. But for Ralph, when they had the extended response interval, that took the least amount of time in terms of him acquiring the skill. The prompt fading was also effective, though it took about 2.5 times longer in terms of reaching the mastery criterion. And then the differential reinforcement never was effective for him in terms of acquiring the response. In that case, it was pretty clear. Extended response prompting was the most effective and the most efficient technique for him. However, and I hope the rest of the participants are the same, but usually if they don't do that, and the other participants were kind of the same, we got to save some space, you're getting every single participant in depth. So we've got Kenny, who, again, didn't take too long when using differential reinforcement. He never mastered the skill in prompt fading. And then even when they started adding in, because again, like you always do, you add in what was the most effective for the participant. Let's make sure that they, we're going to replicate that and make sure that they learn the skill using this technique. Actually, then differential reinforcement didn't lead to acquisition quickly with the other skills being taught. He started making errors using the extended response condition. They moved everything to the reinforcement. He was doing okay, and then he started making errors again. So then they had to add in a separate error correction procedure for him. So while differential reinforcement was both the most efficient and the most effective for him, it wasn't without a couple bumps in the road as well. And then Mario, his results, he just kind of wasn't doing great. And then suddenly was doing great. It didn't matter which condition it was in. Though when you looked at the results, it seemed like extended response and prompt fading seems to be the most effective and efficient for him. Though all three were effective to some extent. We can go over their, discussion points, but I think it's probably going to be more fun, Catia, to hear your thoughts on the overall results as someone who's, been doing research in the field. So I didn't get my clear, here's the answer, use it forever, which is what I'm always searching for, and I never get. You think I'd stop asking for it, but I don't. I won't. I'll get it someday.
Yeah, so I am a big fan of looking at graphs. So what I thought was interesting about Kenny's results is all the errors that he was making in the extended response interval condition. Wouldn't that suggest that maybe his responding was not that dependent on prompts because he's responding before the 10 seconds?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason why, I brought up the whole 5 second, 10 second difference earlier is when do we define a behavior as prompt dependent? Is waiting 5 seconds sufficient to be, to get that classification, or do the assessments need to entail a longer delay? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? You asked me a question. Now I'm asking you a question.
That's not how podcasts work, Catia. No, I asked the question. Yeah, it's a great question. Diana, you probably have a smarter answer, so you should talk.
I don't know if I do or not.
You totally do. Don't worry.
I think that might be interesting if we looked at, in some capacity, like the preference for individuals to respond independently versus being prompted, right? And perhaps Kenny might prefer to just be prompted and get the answer, right? Because then he knows that he's right. He's going to get the reinforcer. But it could be that it's difficult to discriminate whether that prompt is coming or not coming in a 5 second window. Because sometimes there is a delay, right? And you're like, if I just hang out here a little bit longer, then someone will help me, assist me in the answer. But after 10 seconds, that's a much longer period of time. So it could be that the 5 second window is still within the range in which there's possibility that a prompt will occur, right? So it's not discriminable for no prompt is ever going to happen, right? But 10 seconds might kind of meet that criteria. So it could be that Kenny would prefer to wait up to 5 seconds or so and the prompt is coming, but after 10 seconds, it's a lot more discriminable that it's not coming. But that's different than being entirely prompt dependent. It's more a matter of trying to discern what the conditions are under which responding is most likely to receive reinforcement.
Mm.
Yeah. So back to our earlier discussion, where does, what parameter of reinforcement, what consequences are more value could change, right? So up to 5 seconds, I prefer to wait for a prompt. But if it's more than 5 seconds, not only is that prompt being delayed, but also that reinforcer, right? So now it's 10 seconds to the prompt, and then he has to emit the response, and then the reinforcer comes.
Mm-hmm. Versus I'll take my chances, right?
Exactly, right?
Right, on the probability of reinforcement before that point in time.
Exactly, right?
Yeah. Which is what you sort of see in his responding, because he made a lot of errors.
Yeah. So let me take a shot because, maybe a lower rate of reinforcement, but more immediate is better than a more delayed reinforcer if I keep waiting for the prompt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It also speaks a little bit to the point you made earlier too, Catia, of we didn't really talk a lot outside of in some of kind of your introductory thoughts on the topic about the use of correction procedures in the acquisition programs. Were these students who had error correction procedures? If so, what impact does that have? I mean, I think some of the research out there looks at, it's potentially aversive to have to do those correction procedures, to kind of do the response 2 times or, whatever it might be. And does that need to be a part of the discussion, or should we try to avoid having it be a part of the discussion? Because we're always shooting for our errorless learning, but we know that there is always going to be that independent step of hey, we're going to have to just see what happens, and do we want to then plan for that error procedure, knowing that it might have an impact? But is it the impact that we want to have? Should we wait until after we see the levels of acquisition before we even think about what error correction could be? And other than Kenny's results, I don't think it was mentioned in the other articles, the idea of the error correction.
Yeah. So in our paper, we didn't use an error correction procedure purposely because we didn't want the error correction procedure to have an impact on acquisition. So we wanted to eliminate that as a potential variable impacting acquisition. Versus, I believe that Karsten et al., maybe they had an error correction procedure. I don't recall.
I don't think they did either.
Yeah. And so error correction procedure is, just like types of prompts, types of prompt fading procedures, we don't know enough to know how it's going to impact acquisition for an individual. And there's so many different types of error correction procedures. Mm-hmm. Some of them could be aversive to the client, to the therapist, right? If you're repeating the instruction and representing the instruction until independence, that's a long time. It's likely aversive to the therapist. Yeah. But at the same time, if you are providing physical guidance, the physical prompt could be reinforcing to the client.
Or aversive.
Right? It's not as simple. And I think that in general, when we're designing skill acquisition programs for our clients, we should be looking at those variables. Perhaps what we should be doing is begin with some preference and reinforcer assessments to see how do different types of prompts like physical guidance affect that individual's responding. Is it a reinforcer or is it a punisher? Mm-hmm. If it is a reinforcer, don't use a error correction procedure that includes physical guidance. But if it is a punisher, then that could help with acquisition. But then you get into the whole ethical dilemma of, should we be using punishers?
Exactly. You need to be very careful about at what point will we decide we have to use this procedure if this participant or if the learner is going to acquire this skill. And that's Katia, I love these points. And I think, talking about great segues, I think that is a great segue into our dissemination station. There it is. So as much as I know, when I started, getting ready for the episode and reading your article and, reading the Gorgon article, I wanted to be like, and this dissemination station is going to be a slam dunk of do step 1, step 2, step 3, and you're on your way. Never see prompt dependence again. We don't actually have a definitive, one answer, but at least I think, like you were starting to talk about, we do have some good guidelines that practitioners and clinicians should really be taking into account when they're designing their discrete trial or task analysis programs to minimize the risk that responding for some of their clients starts having a prompt dependent component to it. But I would love to hear your kind of continued thoughts on what are the best practices of what we know about, the research that we should be taking into account when we're looking at designing instruction to minimize chances of prompt dependence or to overcome the development of prompt dependence. Mm-hmm.
So ideally, right, as a field, we should focus at prevention of problem behavior in general, right? Prevention. So
absolutely.
We don't need to have jobs. Long story. We need jobs. But, so we know that prompt dependency is the product of the contingencies in the environment, right? Mm-hmm. So as soon as we get that little kid that just got the diagnosis coming in for therapy, ABA services, why not program for differential reinforcement from the start? It's likely that it's not going to impede acquisition in any way, right? That's what the research shows so far, is that kids tend to learn in differential reinforcement. And as a bonus, it may also prevent prompt dependency from developing in that client.
Yeah.
So that would be my suggestion, is we always use differential reinforcement, but we have to be careful about how we are programming that differential reinforcement, right? So what are the consequences, and making sure that the consequences have different reinforcing properties, right? Whether it's praise and edibles, 2 edibles versus 1 edible, and making sure that they have a different qualities or different reinforcing properties, not just presume that they are.
And like you said, you could vary that based on the quality of the reinforcer, the quantity of the reinforcer, the immediacy, the reinforcer, what else it might be paired with at the time, right? So there's a lot of ways in which you could provide differential reinforcement, particularly for young learners. I think you don't want to risk putting their behavior on extinction.
Exactly.
Because we want them to continue to respond and participate. But we also want to promote their independence. That's not our goal, right? Is that we are just going to teach compliance to prompt, right? Or only have someone receive the bulk of their reinforcement following a prompt, right? If they're little kids don't wait for the prompt, right? they're very forward in their actions usually. So I think capitalizing on that and keeping that spirit there is also important. And we can do that through this type of differential reinforcement as well. So it's got multiple bonuses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And differential reinforcement does seem to work in the majority of cases, right? Mm-hmm. So if you do have an individual who's responding is prompt dependent, perhaps differential reinforcement is something that could be trialed first until we know more about ways to determine which procedure is more likely to be effective. Right. I think we should develop a functional assessment for prompt dependency.
Get on it, Catia.
Literally, in my sleep.
I know,
right? One thing that I feel like we need to highlight too is the use of a reinforcer assessment, right? Because too many times I hear people will use just, we've done a preference assessment. They really love Skittles. We're going to give them 3 Skittles instead of 1 Skittle, and that's going to work. But you actually don't know until you assess whether 3 Skittles or 1 Skittle. 3 Skittles is better than 1 Skittles. It may not be.
Exactly.
Right?
It may not.
And I think that is I don't see that enough, right? And I don't see us talking about reinforcer assessments enough. I sometimes get concerned that there isn't enough a distinction between a reinforcer assessment and a preference assessment, right? So they're like, I did a preference assessment. I'm good to go. I've done what I needed to do, right? Or I've not even done that. We saw the research, right?
Yeah.
That Graph did in 2015, where no one's just doing research or no one's just doing preference assessments. And I think using reinforcers that are demonstrated to be reinforcers will help our end game of using differential reinforcement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you're working with young kids, there's so many things that can function as reinforcers that aren't edibles. Right? Yeah. And taking the time to get creative and thinking about what those are, so you're not introducing that contingency, can be really helpful.
Yeah. That was an example. I don't think we should always use edibles.
Let's talk about tickle. Tickle on the back is better than a tickle under the armpit. We could be looking at things like that with the younger children because, everyone loves young children usually love tickles. You're not going to use that for the adolescents and adults. We'll be like, what's up? Please leave me alone now. You are you've become aversive. Good job.
We have those tools available, right? We have formats of preference assessments that can be used for social stimuli.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And every time I say that, people are like, what? It's like, did you read
we did an episode.
The Kelly and all paper, on that. Right? Yeah, right. There are ways to identify a hierarchy for social stimuli, and then you can conduct a reinforcer assessment for those social stimuli, and then you can design a differential reinforcement procedure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have those tools.
I think getting the reinforcer assessment as more a part of ongoing, the onboarding of we have the new student in our program. And I think a lot of programs have gotten better at the idea of we should do a preference assessment, or, we have to update that graph. But the idea of doing a preference assessment sort of makes sense. And then it's like, but why would I do a reinforcement assessment? I just did the preference assessment. Doesn't the research tell me I don't need to do that? And it's like, but here's the other wrinkle of if you add in the reinforcer assessment, you now can answer potential questions before you even need to ask them necessarily of what is going to be the best practice for this learner to avoid leading to this history of prompt dependence. And that, I think I agree with everyone else here that you can't get that answer from the preference assessment. And you can sort of hope that it all works out, that the 2 of the number 1 item is better than the 1 of the number 4 item on my 8 item hierarchy. But there's not a guarantee that is going to be the case. And better to just do the extra assessment and plan for it than get into the position of a lot of prompt dependence going on here. I guess now I can look at my various prompt. So what's the prompt fading? And I can look at the extended prompt delay. That seems more complicated and definitely more kind of long-term planning that could have been avoided.
Yeah. And if you know from the start that, some form of social stimuli is a reinforcer, let's say physical prompts or physical guidance, well, then you avoid that as your error correction procedure for that client. And I think reinforcer assessments don't take that much time. All right. No. You can have very brief sessions. Your sessions can be 1 minute long or 2 minutes long. Mm-hmm. That means you can get an entire reinforcer assessment done in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. which will save a lot of headache in the long term. Your client will learn more.
Yeah.
The other thing is preferences changes, right? I'd like to mention my students a lot, but again, Hannah is finishing a lit review on preference assessments, looking at all the studies that have implemented preference assessments multiple times, like 1 week, a month, 6 months. And preferences are not stable. They're more stable at about a week, sometimes at a month. But if you go more than a month, then the hierarchy from the initial preference assessment is not the same as the hierarchy of that second preference assessment. And we tend to do a preference assessment when we get the new client or once a year when we're updating their BIP. And then, we have the preference assessment. We put it in their binder. Oh, chips is the most preferred. So let's use chips for the next 365 days.
Right.
Unless you're Diana.
I don't want to knock chips. We might have some chip sponsors out there looking for new podcasts
But
to advertise
it's
on.
a broad category.
That's
Right.
Very
broad.
Right? But if you only gave me one type of chip, I might get tired of it. I don't know. Everyone should try and see. I'll let you know the results.
Yeah, everyone,
But
send us
Diana,
chips, please.
Are you getting a bite of a chip every 10 seconds for every single response you emit during the day?
No.
She wishes.
No.
Right?
I'm thinking about that. I'm
I
like, you
don't
know
get chips
what?
on-
That'd be pretty great.
I don't get chips that often.
Okay. So the value of chips remains high for you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Great point. Another good reason not to use edibles all the time.
Please
All right.
vary them. Vary the edibles you're
Vary it
using.
up.
Yeah.
And pair them with praise and other things so we can condition other similes.
Mm-hmm.
Enforcing.
Well, any other thoughts on practice for individuals in terms of thinking about prompt dependence? I think we've covered a lot of it's the preemptive, thinking ahead of time. It's planning. It's taking the extra 2 steps now to avoid the extra 50 steps maybe later, which I know, again, that really just spells out why do humans not actually, do preemptive things, because it's a little hard now for a maybe problem later. I don't know. Let's skip ahead. But we're behavior analysts. We should know better. We can, right? Oh.
I think we covered almost everything, right? We can never cover everything. But I think that if clinicians are seeing that prompt dependency is developing, don't wait, right? It's likely not going to go away unless you do something about it. It's kind of like stereotypy, right? It's not that disruptive, so we just ignore until it gets really bad. Prompt dependency is similar to that. It's not a big deal. He's just waiting a little bit, so I can just prompt, and then it persists and persists, and then it becomes a big deal. Well, we know it's harder to change a behavior that has been reinforced for a longer time, so address it as soon as you see it emerging in that child's repertoire.
Catia, if listeners have questions about the literature, about your study, about prompt dependence, is there a way they can contact you?
Yeah, they can email me because I'm working from home, so don't call my office at USF. My email address is Catia C, so CATIAC at usf.edu. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Excellent. Well, Catia, thank you very much for coming on the show today and talking with us all about prompt dependency. When we knew that you were going to be able to come on, it's one of those topics that, you know what? Yeah, I would like to learn more about that. And it is funny to hear you say that there just wasn't a lot out there, because I don't know a single behavior analyst who hasn't, done one of those, prompt dependency, eye roll frustrated faces at some point. And so you'd think, there's got to be so much literature on there. So I'm glad that what there was, we at least covered, some of it in a lot of depth, at least discussed some of the other pieces as well. And it sounds like there's more on the way that we can kind of be looking forward to reviewing.
Yeah. Thank you all for having me on the show. It was a pleasure. I do hope that our discussion today leads to changes in what clinicians are doing currently, right? Because if prompt dependency is a problem, we are doing something that we should change.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, again, thank you very much to our special guest, Dr. Catia Cividini-Motta, for coming on and talking all about prompt dependence with us today. We also want to say a big thank you to all of you listeners out there. If you like the show, please leave us a review anywhere you can find the show and think about subscribing. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or really anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also find us at social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Pinterest, we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter. You can go to the website at abainsidetrack.com to find the links to the articles that we discussed, as well as these episodes posted. We also post these on YouTube, so you can take advantage, if you so desire, of the YouTube subtitling feature as well. And finally, you can feel free to email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com with feedback, thoughts about previous episodes, or topics you'd like to hear more about. Oh, and finally, before we go, I want to make sure you get our second secret code word if you're interested in learning credits, and that is Carnival. Carnival. So, and if you're in America, you might just go to the Carnival, which doesn't sound as much fun. But if not the same. Yes. But if you're visiting some exciting places, like if you're in Brazil, you could go to Carnival, which is going to be way bigger. You might have seen it in movies. I've never been myself, but it's supposed to be pretty amazing. The movies make it look really cool. So maybe someday when we can leave our houses, I'll check it out. All right, the Carnival. All right, we will be back next week with another full-length episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.